Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on the macroeconomic impacts of the One Big Beautiful Bill, hosted by the Budget Lab at Yale. I am Greg Leiserson, a senior fellow at the Tax Law Center at NYU Law, and I am joined by four distinguished panelists for today's conversation. Wendy Edelberg, a senior fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institution. Martha Gimbel, executive director of the Budget Lab. Kent Smetters, faculty director of the Penn Wharton Budget Model, and Erica York, a vice president of federal tax policy at the Tax Foundation. The reconciliation legislation pending in Congress is an incredibly wide-ranging bill. It includes extension of expiring provisions of the 2017 tax law, but also a range of new tax cuts and tax increases. It would make historically large cuts to Medicaid and the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. It would also scale back student loan repayment programs and radically curtail the clean energy tax credits enacted in 2022. The House passed a version of this legislation in late May, and the Senate is now actively considering its version of the legislation. The two bills share many features in common, but also have some important differences. Today's conversation will focus on the macroeconomic impacts of this legislation, including impacts on the fiscal outlook, on economic growth, and on welfare, which is economists speak for broader conceptualizations of living standards. We'll also situate this bill in the context of the administration's broader economic agenda. Please feel free to put questions in the chat throughout. We will see those. We'll try to incorporate those into the conversation. In other words, please do not hold your questions until the very end of the conversation. And with that, let's get started. I'll turn it over to Wendy first. Wendy, if you could set the stage for us. CBO released a dynamic score of the reconciliation bill last week. What did they find? How would you assess the macroeconomic impacts of this legislation? And how should we think about what this bill is doing?
Yeah, and thanks so much. Happy to be here, particularly with this group. Yeah, so CBO put out its economic analysis of the bill, and the broad takeaway. I mean, I know we'll get into the numbers, and I'm sure we'll get deep into the details of the numbers, but the broad takeaway is that these economic effects are really small. I mean, trivially small, and in some sense, that shouldn't be a surprise, because the point of this bill isn't really to affect economic growth, to my mind. It's to achieve a very different distribution of tax and spending in the United States, make broad changes to immigration policy, make broad changes to energy policy, and indeed, the biggest economic effects that CBO finds are just from, boosts to aggregate demand, like putting more money in people's pockets from not taxing tips, not taxing overtime and the like. And that leads to a small burst in economic activity in the very near term. And that's the biggest effect. One way of putting this in context of how very trivial these economic effects are, over the next 10 years, CBO projects that cumulative GDP, like summing up all the GDP that we're going to have over the next 10 years, will be an astonishing $373 trillion, like an unfathomably large number. And the boost to GDP that's in the CBO numbers is 1.7 trillion over the 10-year period. So you get a sense that this is rounding error. And very small relative to all the other things that move the economy around. So, I hope that when policymakers are thinking about whether or not to vote for it, they're thinking about whether or not, more broadly, this bill just creates the kind of future that they want for the United States in terms of, who's benefiting from the federal government, who's paying taxes to the federal government, and not overly focused on these trivially small effects more broadly. This is just not the point of the bill.
Cool. And thank you. And JCT has published several dynamic scores of tax legislation at this point over the last decade. This is one of the most consequential dynamic scores we've seen for spending legislation. So, Martha, I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about what's new here. What do you see as the most consequential macroeconomic impact of the bill, specifically looking at the spending side of this piece of legislation?
Yeah, I mean, for those of you who aren't sitting in these scores all the time, we get the dynamic score from JCT on the tax provisions, and then we get from CBO, which allows you to kind of get a sense of what's being driven specifically on the spending side. Um, what's kind of interesting about it is that they don't really look that different. So if you look at the JCT score, they found about 3 basis points on GDP growth on average over the next 10 years. CBO found, I believe, 4 basis points, which each of those is, to use a technical term, about bupkis. The difference between them is definitely bupkis. And that's kind of astonishing when you think that you have about $1 trillion that is going on the spending side. And that is a very, very, I mean, it's functionally no impact. And per Wendy's point, part of what you're seeing is because you're just moving things around. So as an example, the labor force participation effects that JCT and CBO finds are the same. CBO explicitly says that part of what's going on there is that there will be cuts to the social safety net, which they do expect to cause people to work more. And at the same time, there's funds to deport more immigrants. And so those two effects will cancel each other out, and leaving labor force participation on this bill, according to their estimates, basically where it was at the beginning. So it does kind of go back to Wendy's point, right, which is that this is not having macroeconomic growth impacts. It's really redistributing what's going on in the economy. And then you have to decide if you think that redistribution is a good idea or a bad idea.
Thanks. And now, Ken, if I could turn to you, Penn Wharton did a dynamic welfare analysis of the House bill in which you concluded that lower income households and some middle class households would be worse off and all future generations would be worse off. Or put a bit more sharply, the winners are sort of the top half of the income distribution alive today. So can you talk us through what is a dynamic distribution analysis? What can we learn from it? What's driving that kind of result? And how could policymakers change that result if they wanted?
Right. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so the conventional analysis is what dominates in DC, not really in academics, but in DC. And, the problems with it is that it often ignores, life cycle effects, the fact, it'll basically say someone who just graduated college making $75,000 a year will be the same as a family of four making $75,000 a year, primary earner age 50 and things like that. It also ignores macro effects and also ignores changes in risk sharing that happens when you get reduced progressivity and things like that. So let me first say on the conventional side, the one thing I will say is that 2 points can be true at the same time. One is that if you just look at deltas, the changes, there's no question, this is not a progressive change, it's more regressive. At the same time, we are starting with a tax system that is very progressive, by far the most progressive in the OECD. And so relative to taxes paid, where you include, for example, earned income tax credit as a negative tax, I mean, it's pretty much proportional to taxes paid, and it's even better if you look at also transfers received. In that sense, it's not regressive in the sense of relative to taxes and transfers received. It's roughly proportional to that. Where it is regressive is obviously based on income, because even a proportional change relative to taxes paid and transfers received, because we start with a very progressive tax system to begin with, it's going to look, quite regressive when you just look at the delta. So I think we just kind of need to level set and see both things going on. But on a dynamic sense, when you account for the fact that conventional analysis doesn't care about who pays for it. It doesn't include any of that. It doesn't include macro effects, doesn't include any changes in risk sharing, things like that. On a dynamic analysis, the type that, more into academics that we would use, it shows that basically the real losers of this is pretty much future generations, because while we get very similar to CBO in terms of economic growth over 10 years, broader than that, after that, it tends to decline the economy. You have this crowding out effect. You have lower wages relative to the baseline. Baseline already is fairly depressed relative to where it would otherwise have been if we didn't have so much debt in the baseline. But nonetheless, it's really future generations are basically worse off, and to the tune of about, maybe $2,000 to $15,000, depending. If you're a higher income born in the future, you lose about $2,000, maybe $4,000, depending on where you're born in the future. Lower income households will lose even more because of the spending cuts and the reduction in risk sharing that has a monetary value to it. And that's closer to $15,000. And that's a one-time hit. That's not obviously per year. It's what economists refer to as equivalent variation. So I think the real cost here, given that it's not a very pro-growth bill, is really on in terms of future generations.
Thanks. So, we've heard some views that the overall growth effects of this bill are, in certain terms, bupkis. One of the reasons for that is the large deficit impacts in at least some models. The administration has pointed to other pieces of its agenda, most notably tariffs, to sort of close that gap. So I wonder, Erica, if you could tell us how would you think about assessing those tariff impacts if we incorporated that or other aspects of the administration's agenda into this conversation? How would you think about the economic impacts of that more comprehensive agenda?
Sure. So the economic impact of tariffs will work in the opposite direction of the economic impact of the tax bill over the next decade. So if you look at like CBO's estimates of what does the tax bill do to economic output, they estimate on average output will be about 0.6% larger by the end of the decade. AEI has looked and said, no, CBO is 0.5, AEI is 0.6. At Tax Foundation, we estimate it's about 0.8%. So compared to the revenue loss, like Wendy, Martha Kent have said, that's a really meager effect on output for a really large revenue loss. So that tells us that we're looking at a pretty inefficient combination of tax cuts that Congress is considering. And then when you combine that with what the administration is looking at, tariffs, that's a very inefficient way to raise tax revenue. So if you do a dynamic analysis that combines the tax cuts in Congress, at least as the House has passed and envisioned right now, with the tariffs that the administration is imposing, you'll find that the result is something that increases the deficit and shrinks the overall size of the economy. When we think about tariffs, they themselves have a negative impact on output, both through reducing the after-tax return to labor, also increasing the cost of capital investment in the United States. And that's just the effect of US imposed tariffs. When we impose tariffs, we invite foreign retaliation that has a further negative impact on output in the US. That makes it a very inefficient way to raise $1 of revenue. And if you raise $1 of revenue that way and use it to pay for a really inefficient tax cut, your result is a hit to GDP. Most models find that the tariffs will fall short of actually offsetting the deficit impact of the House bill. CBO's estimates have found that they're pretty close to offsetting, but our estimates at Tax Foundation find you're still left with about a $500 billion gap over the next decade. So overall, even if you assume that the tariffs will stay around, which is a very unlikely assumption, given the on-again, off-again nature, given the pending legal challenges. Even if you make that assumption, it still falls short of the paying for the bill claim, and it more than offsets any positive economic benefit we could expect. So it really doesn't line up with a lot of the talking points we're hearing that, oh, well, tariffs will make this all okay. They actually make the situation a lot worse.
Thanks. And momentarily, we'll dig a little bit more deeply into some of the specific provisions. But before we do that, let me just pause here and see if any of our panelists would like to respond or expand or elaborate on anything in response to other panelists or their thoughts based on what has happened to date.
Oh, I will take that invitation and run with it. So a couple things. One, just to add to Erica's excellent list of why all of these estimated effects of how much revenue the tariffs will raise, I want to add one more thing that I don't think was on her list, which is in a handful of years we'll have a new president. And the idea that the next president, I mean, first, it's unfathomable to me that Trump will commit to keeping the tariffs that are currently in place for the remainder of his term. Unfathomable. But then, moreover, these revenue effects that are being bandied about, and even that CBO put out, they were very transparent about how they approach this. They assume that the next president and the next president, and I think even half of the next term of the next president, also keep those tariffs in place. So it's absurd. I want to say two other quick things while I have the floor, and then maybe promise not to say anything more for the rest of this entire event. One, I don't promise that at all. One is, when we talk about, often the language that we use around tax cuts and the cost of tax cuts is whether they pay for themselves. And I just want to, put a stake in the ground that tax cuts don't pay for themselves. And here's why. Unless, we would have to get a whole bunch of academics together to come up with the best, most efficient, most awesome kind of tax cut to get it to quote unquote pay for itself. And the reason is, if you have a tax cut that increases the deficit by, let's say, $100 billion, in order for it to pay for itself, it has to increase GDP by more than $500 billion. And that's because, taxes revenues as a share of GDP are now well below 20%. And so what that would mean, in the current context, is, we're talking about this bill boosting GDP by on average 0.4% over the next decade. In order for it to quote unquote pay for itself, it would have to be that economic effect, that boost to GDP would have to be an order of magnitude larger. It would have to boost GDP by 4% instead of 0.4%. And so just whenever you hear somebody claim that a tax cut's going to pay for itself, just, in your mind, think about how very, very large that GDP effect has to be relative to the tax cut. I'm going to say one last thing, which is, I'm also, now having said all of that, I'm worried that we are talking too much about the deficit effect of not just this bill and its effect on future generations. I totally agree with Kent that it is going to make future generations poorer, and not just how much is going to get offset by tariffs and the positive effect on revenues from tariffs, but what I wish that this Congress and this president was talking about is they are looking to reshape fiscal policy broadly over the next decade. Reshape the social safety net, reshape revenues, reshape energy policy. And at a certain point, it's absurd just to talk about how much that changes the deficit. Let's talk about what that means for all of fiscal policy over the next 10 years. And what it means for all of fiscal policy is an increase in borrowing of approximately $24 trillion. That's not the delta, that's just the whole kit and caboodle, $24 trillion. I'm not particularly worried about that, but we have lots of evidence that this Congress and this president, well, actually less evidence about this president. He seems a little bit more aware of that $24 trillion. This Congress is deluding itself of what the fiscal policy it's putting in motion will mean for borrowing. And I find that immensely frustrating.
I'm just going to jump onto that point that Wendy was just making, because as we've been talking about the macroeconomic impacts of what's going on here, one thing we have not talked about is the impact on interest rates. So CBO's analysis, right, shows that you'll have higher interest rates by about 14 basis points at the end of the 10 years. And when you look at their dynamic score, right, they say on a conventional basis, it'll cost 2.4 trillion. There is positive growth on average, right, through the 10 years, but it is still the case that the dynamic score is more expensive because of the interest rate costs. And I think that that is really important to keep in mind, right, is that there are costs, there's the direct costs, there's the interest rate costs, those then spill over onto consumers as well. And also it's important to think about the macroeconomic moment that we're in, right? This isn't 2009. This isn't even 2017, where I think there was an argument that there was a need for some additional fiscal activity. You can argue whether or not TCJ was the right one, but there was clearly room for that. We're in a very different macroeconomic situation at this time. And I think that difference is Congress is not responding to the overall macroeconomic context in the way that many economists would like them to, I think is the way to put that.
All right, well, let's now dig in a little bit more specifically on the tax provisions. Martha, I'm going to come back to you for this one. The reconciliation bill includes several new provisions corresponding to promises that were made during the campaign. Things like no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, preferences for interest on car loans. These are some of the most expensive provisions that do not have an antecedent in the 2017 tax law. So can you talk us a little bit through these provisions, their merits, their macroeconomic consequences?
Yeah, I mean, these are largely from the campaign where President Trump, kept promising that certain types of labor income largely would be exempted from taxation. I'm including Social Security and that as, something that people get back after having paying into. In some ways, right, as economists, we often want to hedge there because these aren't things that have been tried in the United States before. And so if you say like, well, what's the impact? Well, we don't have studies. We don't know. We haven't done this before. We can talk theoretically how we would expect it to play out, which is very little macroeconomic impact, lots of reclassification and shifting of how income is classified, but not necessarily like an increase in hours worked. I will say the only direct evidence that I'm aware of is from France, that tried something different, but let's call it similar. And, we are not France, we are a different country, but probably applies here. And what they found was that there was not an increase in hours worked, but that they did see a change in how people reclassified their time to try to get it as overtime. And so that's sort of what I would expect here, is that you won't see, a big increase in hours worked. You're just going to see people reclassifying what their income looks like. I will say, if people are then spending time reclassifying how, trying to evade taxes, that is actually in its own way, a tax on productivity. That's a thing that people are doing instead. So it comes back to, I think if people were trying to think of how you would structure changes in the tax code to try to increase labor force participation, none of these provisions would be at the top of any economist's list.
So Wendy, you've alluded to previously the thinking of this bill as a sort of reorientation of public policy across a range of dimensions. The bill includes some very specific major changes to the safety net. Can you what would those changes mean for children and for the next generation?
So truthfully, I am betting that there are others on this call that are better positioned to answer that question in detail. I mean, the reductions to SNAP are significant. I've paid particular attention to those changes, and just SNAP is one of our most effective programs at helping children who are and families more broadly, but children who do not have regular and reliable access to food. It's a really efficient program. This is going to reduce access to healthcare. It makes particularly cruel changes to access to the safety net for immigrants. And then, takes, just additional swipes at immigrants doing things like taxing remittances when they want to send payments overseas, which, has been, I think, very cleverly referred to as a capital control. It effectively is. It's basically, taxing people in the United States who want to be able to move their money overseas. The distributional effects of this bill are pretty well known. I bet other people on this could add more insight.
I'm just going to hop on there super quickly, which is, we keep talking about the distributional impacts of this bill, but as, Wendy and Erica and others have discussed, the administration often talks about this bill as being paired with tariffs. And then if you combine those together, it then becomes even more regressive. So when, the Budget Lab team looked at this, what we find is that 80% of people are worse off under that comparison. And then, 10% are basically held, they get an additional $50 or something. So congratulations to them. And then the top 10% in income do better. But it just speaks to the way that this is structured and how, tariffs hit throughout the income distribution, that it just even further concentrates who benefits from this combination of fiscal policies.
One other thing that I'll just throw in on this is that the House version raises the debt ceiling by $4 trillion. The Senate version raises it by $5 trillion. What that would mean is that despite, as I said, I firmly believe that this Congress and this president are, putting us on a path. They are remaking fiscal policy in a lot of different ways and putting us on a path to need to be able to borrow, about 24 trillion over the next decade. And yet they're only raising the debt ceiling by 4 or 5 trillion. And I think the reason that they're doing that, maybe I sound cynical, but I don't think I'm being cynical. I'm actually just, reading what the senators and the congressmen are saying when they talk to reporters, is that when we again hit the debt ceiling in late 2026, early 2027, they are excited to get another bite at the apple to say, you want us to raise the debt ceiling? Well, then we're going to have to talk about cuts in spending. And, I sound cynical, I think, but they are creating a need for a huge amount of borrowing over the next decade. And by not financing it, they are trying to give themselves leverage to put in place further spending cuts that I guess they don't feel like they have the political wherewithal to do right now.
Martha, we have a question in the chat that I'd like to direct to you, which is basically if you could elaborate a little bit on the differences in the economic context in 2008, 9, 2017, and today, and why how that's informing your view of this legislation in this moment compared to prior moments.
Yeah, I mean, 2008, 2009, we were obviously in the middle of like a very, very intense recession. where it's a little weird to say that an economy is screaming out because economies don't like have voices, but let's just go with that. For more fiscal spending, right, in order to stimulate the economy and get us back on track. One of the debates that people had in 2017, and even before then, was whether or not the economy needed more spending. And there was a ton of back and forth on that of like, did we need to be retrenching given debt, et cetera? I think in retrospect, it's clear that there was space in that time period for additional spending to help the economy fully recover from the Great Recession. The Great Recession was we don't know, it's a whole other conversation, but the Great Recession was a financial crisis. We know financial crises take a particularly long time for economies to recover from. We needed more help than we were getting from the federal government. People have a lot of debates about what form that spending should have taken. I'm not talking about what the spending should have looked like. I'm just purely talking about additional dollars. Where we are right now is we are just coming off of an inflationary period, where, there was government spending and that did play a role in some of the inflation. And, inflation has come down substantially. We have been in a pretty good place there. We'll see what happens moving forward. But it's not the case that an economy that is coming off of an inflationary period with a still low unemployment rate needs trillions of dollars thrown at it, right? There's another aspect of this, which is that if you were thinking that you needed to stimulate the economy, and I think one thing, I hope if anyone takes anything away from this conversation, is that this bill does not stimulate the economy. This is not how you would structure the bill. If you were thinking about fighting recession, which, just to reiterate, we are not, you would not be cutting Medicaid. You would not be cutting SNAP. You would certainly not be making these kinds of permanent changes to the tax code, although there's a lot of stuff that's temporary in here. You would be doing plus ups to unemployment insurance. You would be doing this kind of counter-cyclical fiscal spending, and that's not what this is. And so it is odd to be doing this level of like functionally fiscal stimulus at a time when the economy just doesn't need it. And I think you see this in the scores that have been put out where, again, you're not seeing these big estimates on economic growth, but you are seeing increases in interest rates, which suggests, right, that you're going to see the Federal Reserve have to basically fight the inflation that will result from this.
Thanks. So, Eric, if I could turn to you now, Martha mentioned that there's a variety of permanent and temporary policies in this bill. One of the motivations for this bill is extending the temporary provisions of the 2017 legislation. If we play this forward and we imagine another bill addressing temporary provisions in this bill, what does that look like? Where does that take you? What does that say that the next conversation is going to be about?
I think one of the motivations for why we're seeing these extra tax cuts on top of TCJA extension is because if you just extend current policy, like the average taxpayer is not going to feel like they got a tax cut. If my child tax credit in 2025 is $2,000 and Congress passes a law saying, okay, it's going to be $2,000 again in 2026, it's hard to sell that as a tax cut to people because they're operating mentally on the current policy baseline, right? What's status quo? I don't feel any better than status quo. So I think that's one of the reasons why we're seeing not just extension, but all of these other things tacked on to extension. A lot of them, like Martha said, hearkening back to the president on the campaign trail. But then you have the budgetary concerns coming in. And so we see the House bill in particular sunset all of these no tax on XYZ provisions, as well as these other temporary enhancements like to the standard deduction, the child tax credit maximum, an above the line deduction for charitable giving, plus all of these business extenders. They all sunset either after 2028 or 2029. So that sets up future lawmakers to, again, decide, okay, are we going to keep these temporary tax cuts or not? You could even see that same concept come into play. Well, if we're just extending these existing provisions, we're going to be incurring a big hit to the deficit. People aren't going to feel like there's a benefit to them. So what do we need to tack onto that to really sell it again, on down the road? The Senate, I will say, has taken a bit of a different approach. They do more permanence than the House version of the bill. So the standard deduction, the above the line charitable deduction, the business provisions, those are all done on a permanent basis, those enhancements. They do still sunset these provisions from President Trump. So whichever, path we end up taking, we are set up for another fiscal cliff in 2028. And even if it's just a fiscal cliff related to the president's tax priorities, in the Senate version, those are roughly $60 billion a year in revenue at stake. So it's another very large tax cut potentially on the table just a few years down the line. So to what Wendy was saying, like, how's this setting us up for the fiscal situation going forward? It's even worse than what it looks like in the bill because so many of these provisions are going to expire. And presumably, they won't be allowed to expire in full. So there's going to be even more revenue loss in the future. And I will say, this for those of us who are interested in like structural tax reform, what can we do to improve the overall structure of the tax code, simplify it, enhance incentives people face for work, saving, and investment? The motivation of, oh, we just have to extend these expiring tax cuts is not a very good motivator for actual tax reform. I think we're kind of seeing that play out right now. It's not a, what can we do to rethink the structure, to really improve the system? It's, oh, we've got to extend this and we've got to do it in a way that can be sold politically. So that leads to some of these compromises, I think, that a lot of us on the, policy wonk side of things would not choose to make. So we could see that playing out again here in 4 years.
Thanks. And Kent, turning to you, I think we've heard a fair amount about deficit debt impacts, challenges of the fiscal outlook. Penn Wharton is sort of known for having a model that is fairly deficit hawkish. I'm curious, sort of, can you sum up for us in sort of your view on where the fiscal outlook is, were the reconciliation bill to pass, and what that means going forward?
Sure. I mean, first, just start with the baseline. All these comparisons are relative to baseline, but as people pointed out, Wendy and others, is that even without any change in taxes and spending right now, just current law, we're on an exploding path of debt. And so that already is going to lead to less capital formation, lower wages, higher interest rates for future generations. And so this, incrementally adds to that without doing much to stimulate or offset with higher investments and things like that. And so, we could, fundamentally change the baseline itself. It's going to require something much bigger than certainly this. It's going to also require, reducing debt. So we posted something on the Penn Wharton budget model. This was late December last year that basically just tries to deal with the baseline. And it basically says, yes, you could actually stabilize the debt GDP ratio, even bring it down, while actually growing the economy quite a bit, and even increasing progressivity a bit by basically getting rid of old age poverty and getting to almost near universal health care coverage. But it requires something on the order of, like, think about 1986, times 2. I mean, it requires something quite big, a dramatic simplification that Erica pointed out. I mean, we have an incredible tapestry of all these different spending programs that create weird marginal tax incentives along the way. And so just the baseline itself is pretty nerve-wracking. Then when you layer in tariffs on top of that, In a model with capital and production, tariffs tend to not lead to a dollar appreciation, especially with the presence of intermediate goods in production. What tend to do just the opposite. In fact, what we saw on April 2nd, if Trump had gone through and not reversed course, the dollar would have plummeted even more. Capital was leaving the US and so forth. So now you're trying to sell this debt, even along the baseline, into a more narrow capital market going forward. And so one could write down different models, we're saying the capital markets don't change that much, or they do. Certainly the endowment economy of undergraduate textbook economics, they don't change that much, but in a more robust economy, they tend to change. And so you're taking these tariffs, as Erica pointed out, a really inefficient way of raising revenue. And we show that it's almost twice as distorting than just getting the same revenue just by increasing the corporate income tax. That's kind of the most distorting way of raising revenue before tariffs. And so you're trying to sell all this debt into more narrowing capital markets over time. And that creates, even if you use all that tariff revenue to pay down debt, it's still a negative, a sharp negative response to the economy. And so you put all these things together, just adding more to it. I mean, relative to the baseline, it's not a huge addition, right? It's like a 10% increase in primary deficits over the next decade relative to what we otherwise would have had. But that's not a great message, because that's just more of a comment about how challenging current law already is. And so I think that is the part that, almost none of the models are showing that you're going to get positive macro effects over a long period of time. Over the next 10 years, us and CB are about the same in terms of, they're for different reasons though, but are roughly around the same, about small 0.4% in terms of pure level GDP, as Wendy points out, doesn't come close to paying for itself. But the much bigger question still is current law. Current law is on a just a runaway trajectory right now, and it's not like we have a lot of fiscal capacity. We've done these calculations. You mentioned our debt hawkish model. We've actually kind of tamed it in many ways. We have another model, what we call our moonshot model, that's actually our standard model takes several hours across thousands of processors to solve. Our full model is about 20,000 times bigger, and it basically has even larger effects of debt, and it's able to replicate the relationship that we see historically between debt and interest rates being somewhat muted, because a lot of that evidence has come from cyclical and not from secular changes. But then when you put these secular changes into it, it's even more depressing. And we've estimated that basically the US cannot go in terms of its federal debt above around 190% of GDP. And we're going to be there easily within 20 years. And that's under the assumption that capital markets constantly believe that the federal government will eventually get its act together. As soon as they stop believing, everything unravels in our model. We go to this bank-run equilibrium. Everything unravels in our model very quickly. And so we really have very limited time to deal with this, and the baseline is much more scary than almost anything else.
Thanks, Tim. And let me open that up to our other panelists if anybody would like to dig in a little bit more on interest rates or the debt trajectory.
So I just wrote a paper with two colleagues of mine at Brookings, Ben Harris and Louise Shaner, and we thought hard about what could create the kind of cataclysmic scenarios that Kent is describing. And so, in effect, what could create a fiscal crisis? And I don't think, we thought hard about this and did a lot of work to, I think, persuasively show that it's not the grindingly higher borrowing year in and year out. And indeed, as much as I completely agree with all of the channels that I know are in Ken's model, where he's got crowding out and he's got higher interest rates and he's got, us sending higher interest payments to foreign holders of US debt, and that's reducing incomes of people in the US, relative to, all the goods and services that we produce. I think I suspect that Kent and I are in agreement on all of those channels. I think that a really important aspect of the US economy and fiscal policy is our revenues as a share of GDP in the US at about 17%, maybe going down to 16% if this bill passes, are really low. They're quite low relative to US standards, and they're very low relative to OECD standards. And so if you were to let debt rise as it's projected to under current law, or frankly, even as it would under this reconciliation bill, if you were to let debt rise over even 30 years, which is a longer time frame than Kent just suggested, and then say, okay, we commit to stabilizing debt as a share of GDP entirely through taxes. All we're going to do is increase taxes to stabilize debt. That would be, that would be remarkable to not do anything on the spending side. But let's say we did it. Revenues as a share of GDP in the United States would still be lower than the average share for OECD countries. So this is just all to say that one of the reasons why I don't think the fiscal trajectory that we have under current law, or even that we would have under this bill if it passes, one of the reasons I don't think that is inextricably means that in some planning horizon over the next decades that gets us to a fiscal crisis is because we clearly have immense taxing capacity if our backs were up against the wall and we wanted to very quickly stabilize the debt. Now, I'm not saying that wouldn't come with pain. There would be enormous pain. I, among lots of people, do not want to see my tax rates rise by, 4 percentage points. Not saying there's no pain, but the difference between pain and a fiscal crisis. Now, that's not to say I am not worried about a fiscal crisis. And Kent described it really well. The day markets lose faith, it doesn't matter if debt as a share of GDP is 89%, 95%, 110%, 140%. The day they lose faith in US policymakers and say, we don't want to hold treasuries anymore, is a day that US Treasury rates rise by percentage points, not tenths, percentage points. And then the big question is, do policymakers get the message and put on their big boy and big girl pants and act like grown-ups? Or do they, dig in and continue to, act like clowns in a clown car? And then you really have a sustained fiscal crisis. I am much more worried about policymakers proving themselves to not be trustworthy and losing the faith of financial markets than I am about grindingly higher debt.
Thank you. Now, as we're approaching the end of our time together, I thought we could do a round robin of we've heard some critical things about this bill. How would our panelists make the bill better? And of course, I phrased the question that way because I'm an economist and therefore temperamentally critical. We also have a question in the Q&A for what are the best parts of the bill. So I open up to our panelists both for how would you improve this bill to deliver whatever set of objectives you would say is worth achieving, and then if you have any favorite parts of the bill that are on the table, what are those?
I'll go first. I think to improve the bill, it should raise the debt ceiling by $24 trillion and acknowledge that it is committing the US to enormous borrowing, at least over the next decade.
I'll go next. I'll focus in on the tax side. I think one of the things the 2017 law did well was increase the standard deduction, which did simplify the filing system for millions of taxpayers. So sticking with that and not backing down on the limitations on itemized deductions, which the House bill does by increasing the SALT cap quite substantially. So I think those two changes of the TCJA should be kept and built on, and those can be done in a revenue neutral way, increasing the standard deduction for limitations on itemized deductions. And the other improvement, which we've seen movement toward on the Senate side, is permanence for some of the key provisions targeted at lowering the cost of capital in the United States. So expensing for R&D, expensing for short-lived assets like machinery, equipment, software. And from the fiscal perspective, those tend to be really cost effective because they're not providing a net tax cut. They're changing the timing of deductions. So over time, it's not a large reduction in government revenue. It's a changing in the timing that lowers the cost of capital for businesses. So I think focusing on those key provisions that we know performed well after 2017, leaving the rest, avoiding this large increase in the deficit that will put future generations on the hook would be what's needed to actually make this be a pro-growth and fiscally responsible bill. Right now, it falls short of both of those claims.
I will steal moderator's privilege for a second to agree and expand with one thing Erica said. So Erica mentioned that the House version of the bill has a higher limit on the SALT cap. The Senate version of the bill takes a different approach, and I will say on the one hand, the drafting is clear as mud, but one possible interpretation of that is a much more generous treatment of the state workarounds of SALT. So we have sort of two different approaches there. The Senate version may be even more generous than the House version. And you know, if Congress had the courage of its original convictions, if those were its convictions, we would probably be in a better place. Martha, I saw you were about to chime in.
Yeah, I mean, I can do the whole, I would make this bill better by being deficit neutral or, et cetera, like the bigger picture things. Let's just take that as read. One thing that I think is frustrating about this bill is that one of the ways that this bill is saving money is by increasing the administrative burdens on a lot of programs. Greg won't say this, but I will say Greg wrote a very great piece for the NYU Tax Law Center on this with respect to the EITC, and I would encourage everyone to read it. Increasing administrative burdens such that people fall off of these programs is a particularly inefficient and I think bad way to cut these programs if you accept the premise that they need to be cut, to be clear. You're going to end up throwing, in many ways, the most vulnerable people off of these programs because they are not able to have the time or the ability to figure out how to meet that incredibly high administrative burden. And so I would really prefer that we figure out a different way for people to interact with the safety net in this country rather than trying to make it, American Ninja Warrior just to get your EITC payment.
So most of the value economically from taxes and spending really comes from, avoiding those really high margin utility states for low income people, whether it's food, shelter, healthcare, things like that, and not worrying about so much fine tuning, things like that, and then just promoting growth. This bill really does not deliver on the second one. I mean, there's lots of things that I would do differently. I would switch to a destination-based tax. I would do things that are much more focused on the margin, things that are just unrealistic, politically probably. At the same time, current law is completely zero probability of working, and so we do need some fundamental changes. This is certainly not moving in that in that right direction. I will say, you know, if we're trying to think through what could be done modestly, realistically, and so forth. Certainly, focusing on at a minimum deltas relative to current law and not current policy is incredibly important procedurally going forward. Is what will happen if, you know, the current policy baseline becomes accepted. I mean, it's just subject to enormous abuse, and so what could potentially happen going forward too is that even though CBO will in fact still deliver a score that is relative to current law, if we get too comfortable with current policy, I mean, JCT just released something relative to current policy, that is pretty much raises the question, why even have scoring agencies at that point? Just because it becomes there's no point of scoring at that point. If when Democrats take control, at some point they could pass a child tax credit for 1 year, and then during that year pass it for 10 years, and it looks like it's costless. I mean, this is a game that could be played by both sides, and so we kind of need this détente, this agreement that we don't do this. And so just being clear in terms of the optics and being clear in terms of information, being, you know, really credible, I think is going to be very important over the next several years, especially as we start to think through things that are not going to be tackled by this in terms of the entitlement program, Social Security. We really need credibility with it, with the scoring agencies, and forcing them to do current policy is certainly not going to be enhancing their credibility.
Thank you, Kent. And with that, we're coming up on time. So let me say thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our hosts at the Budget Lab at Yale. And thank you to all of you for coming and joining in this conversation with us for the past hour. I hope it has been useful and informative in your thinking and understanding of the One Big Beautiful Bill. Thank you.